Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our public panel discussion on enhancing post-pandemic sustainability and resilience. Thank you so much for joining us I hope people are joining us from all around the world, but particularly those of you who are joining us from the UK on such a beautiful and sunny evening. It looks like spring or summer has actually finally arrived. I am Dr. Karina Fernley, and I will be your chair this evening. And this event is hosted jointly by the UCL Global Governance Institute that promotes cross-disciplinary research and informed public debate on possible solutions to global societal challenges, and the UCL Warning Research Centre that is unique in bringing together global expertise to explore the roles of the ways in which warnings can help manage vulnerabilities, hazards, risks and disasters. Together with Dr. Tom Pegram, we have received some funding from the UCL Global Challenges Programme and the UCL Environmental Domain to explore complex risk governance for a green and sustainable recovery for COVID-19. And we hope that you will find this session this evening very interesting as we attempt to tackle some of the most complex and challenging problems that humanity faces today. So hold on to your seats. So allow me just to set the scene a little bit. COVID-19 has highlighted the compounding risks that systemic disruptions pose in an increasingly interconnected world. Yet complex risks are not new, and neither are calls for greener, fairer, and more sustainable societies. Whilst previous efforts to induce such rapid and wide-reaching societal transformations have been largely unsuccessful, the COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to represent a real tipping point. As Simone Abrams states, COVID has laid bare the vulnerabilities in our society and made bold and innovative policy making essential and undeferrable. The time to start is now. The pandemic has created an opportunity to dramatically and drastically rethink policy making made based on the realization that human and planetary health are inextricably interconnected. A green and sustainable recovery is possible if there is a genuine commitment to learn from past mistakes and design novel systems that support both humans and nature. So there is now wide agreement that recovery efforts must support both human well-being and environmental sustainability in a manner that is inclusive and prioritises those that are most vulnerable. However, translating this vision into concrete policies and governance mechanisms remains an ongoing challenge. Importantly, such responses must also take into account the need to prepare for other future large-scale risks, some of which we may be aware of and some of which remain unknown unknowns. But key things include climate change and novel health emergencies. The panel tonight brings together leading experts from government, civil service, civil society and the private sector to discuss the prospects for building back better towards a more sustainable and resilient future. And we have three distinguished panelists joining us tonight. We have Lord Toby Harris, who's the chair of the National Preparedness Commission. We have Amanda Janu, who's the knowledge and policy lead for the Wellbeing and Economy Alliance, and Rowan Douglas, CVE of the Willis Insurance Risk Management Team. Now, before I get started, just a couple of housekeeping notices. There will be a Q&A following our panel speakers' presentation, so please do place any questions that you have into the Q&A box, and we will go through those and ask some of those following our speakers. And also, please note that the event will be recorded and made publicly available following the event. So it is now my pleasure to first introduce Lord Toby Harris, who has been a life peer since 1998 and has been chair of the Labour Peers since 2012. He sits as a member and is currently the vice chair of the Joint Committee on National Security and is currently a member of the Committee on Life Beyond COVID. Outside Parliament, he is president of the Institute of Strategic Risk Management and chairs the National Preparedness Commission, whose mission is to promote better preparedness for a major crisis or incident. The Commission's programme of work is intended to be both strategic and practical. He also has been chair of the National Training Standards and the chair of the Fundraising Regulator. So thank you very much, Lord Toby Harris. I pass over to you now for your thoughts on our fascinating topic for this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karina, and good evening to everyone. Can I apologise? Actually, I'm not going to apologise for the sun virtually obliterating my image because it's really rather nice. But I'm sorry if that is a distraction. So 2020 was not the year that anyone expected. Indeed, at the beginning of last year, few would have predicted the scale of what was about to unfold with repeated national lockdowns, or that even now there would be huge uncertainty as to what will or will not be permissible in 3 weeks' time. Who predicted the apotheosis of Zoom, the transfer of most interactions online, or that at various times more than half of the world's population would be subject to lockdown restrictions? Certainly the speed with which the norms of society unravel, with deserted city centres, businesses shut down, enforced social distancing and mask wearing, came as a shock to many. However, we should have been ready. If you look at the course of previous pandemics, COVID has not been so different. Spanish flu hit a peak in the spring of 1918. There was then a more intense second peak 6 to 9 months later. And the bad news is that there was then a third peak 6 months after that. And of course, epidemics have occurred traumatically throughout history. So it's not surprising then that pandemic flu has been in the top tier of the UK's National Risk Register since it was first published a decade ago. But of course, COVID was not flu. It has, for example, different requirements for personal protection equipment, and crucially, a strong ability to spread asymptomatically. But new and emerging infectious diseases, and COVID would have fallen into that category, were considered in the risk register. However, the conclusion was that they would have a, quote, low likelihood of spreading to the UK, and that the impact might be of the order of 250 cases over several months. So in the UK, the risk was logged, but not considered particularly serious, and it was felt in any case that the preparations in place for a pandemic flu outbreak would be sufficient. I am tempted to dwell at length about what went wrong, but I will attempt to resist it. And certainly the UK was not alone. Most governments had failures either in preparation or in execution of their COVID response. And no crisis is ever exactly what you plan for. So the UK government has announced that it will now start developing a comprehensive national resilience strategy. You might be forgiven for being surprised that this process is only being started now and that such a comprehensive strategy did not exist before. In addition, the process and methodology by which the National Security Risk Assessment is drawn up is to be reviewed. But nations are rather like many businesses and organisations that too often feel they have dealt with a potential problem by the mere act of putting it on their risk register, or the individual feels that they've dealt with the difficult task by putting them on their to-do list. But in a business, the risk register is often taken as the last item at a busy board meeting, relegated to the final few minutes as people are packing up their papers to leave. And then when something does happen, when there is a major shock to the system, many organisations pat themselves on the back that they've been resilient if they manage to bounce back quickly and speedily return to normal operation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but the ambition should be greater. The aim should be to learn from what has happened, not merely so that that particular eventuality that has occurred can be dealt with or avoided if it happens again, but rather to so toughen the organisation that it becomes better able to respond to and be ready for the next crisis. And there will be a next crisis. At the beginning of this year, Dr. Mike Ryan, head of the emergencies programme at the World Health Organization, said that COVID was, quotes, a wake-up call. While the pandemic had been severe and affected every corner of the planet, again I quote, it is not necessarily the big one. Now, the new National Preparedness Commission that I chair was conceived before COVID hit, but the last year has highlighted how vital its central purpose to promote better preparedness in the UK for a major crisis or incident has become. The Commission brings together 45 leading figures from public life, academia, business and civil society. At its first meeting last November, Commissioners were warned that irrespective of COVID, we are living in a world that is increasingly volatile and unstable. Indeed, a month after that meeting, a new edition of the National Risk Register was quietly published on the gov.uk website. This maps 38 major risks facing the country, including environmental hazards, major accidents, malicious attacks, cyber-based and terrorist, risks arising overseas, and inevitably animal and human diseases. But there are also a series of global trends that are likely to impact directly or indirectly on the UK in the coming years. First and foremost is climate change. This is likely to lead to more extreme weather events, both at home and abroad. Floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, and heavy rainfall will become more intense and more frequent. This will mean that some parts of the world will become increasingly uninhabitable, driving huge movements of refugees and leading to shortages of food and water, with an impact on global supply chains and producing political instability that will spill over national borders. Second, the world can expect increased competition for natural resources with greater supply insecurities. And this is in the context of a changing world order and rapid geopolitical change, with perhaps the US surrendering its preeminence, China becoming an increasingly dominant economic power, Russia using hybrid means to maximize its influence, and the future of the European Union becoming less certain. And we've seen all of this play out in the last few months over COVID vaccines, with bitter rows within the EU, and with Russia, China, and at one stage, ironically, even India, magnanimously offering vaccine supplies to potential client nations around the world. So COVID vaccines became part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, are analogous to Russia's oil pipeline to Western Europe, and the global efforts to corner supplies of rare earth minerals that are an essential component of so many modern technologies. And then think back 3 months. We had the Texas power failure, an illustration of vulnerability in a modern, highly industrialized nation. And that highlighted the failure to invest adequately in the maintenance of critical infrastructure. It highlighted the reliance on ever more complex and interconnected systems. And above all, it highlighted the dangers of cascade collapse. Now, such vulnerabilities exist around the globe. And as in Texas, there is no one entity responsible for mitigating those vulnerabilities. So we can expect some crises to arise suddenly and unexpectedly, requiring urgent action. But others will develop over decades. We need to be better prepared for whatever may occur. Now, a National Preparedness Commission has in essence to focus therefore on 3 questions. What should we prepare for? How much preparedness is enough? And how do we finance the necessary investment? And these are not just questions for national government. And there is a welcome recognition of this in the government's integrated review published 2 months ago, which explicitly promises a comprehensive strategy based on a whole of society approach involving individuals, businesses and organisations. Indeed, as the Commission has been saying since it was established, making every level of government, every organisation and every community more resilient creates a sort of, if I dare use the phrase, a sort of herd immunity for a society better able to address future global crises, whether it's a new pandemic or a massive cyber attack or climate change. And this is also true for each household and every individual. We all have to play our part. Genuinely, as somebody once said, we are all in it together. And of course, this is true for nations as well as households. We will not truly escape the current pandemic until the world is vaccinated. And of course, if climate change is to be addressed, there has to be global action. In an increasingly complex and interconnected planet, while one nation may choose to freeload, if too many do, we all fail. And the existential issue for humanity is how long will it be before that is a truth universally accepted. But one thing we should learn from 2020 is that we cannot go on burying our heads in the sand. We need to be better prepared for the unexpected. The lesson for all of us, the overriding lesson in every country, is that we have probably not been investing sufficiently in our preparedness and resilience. That investment and that preparedness has to be at national, and for that matter, at international level. It has to be at neighbourhood level and in every business organisation, from the largest enterprise to the smallest micro business. In essence, we have to try and predict the unpredictable, prepare for the uncertain, and recognise some of it will be wrong. I rather like the taxonomy, which says we have to be ready not only for the black swans, previously unobserved, high-impact, hard-to-predict rare events, but also for black jellyfishes, things we think we know about and understand, but which turn out to be more complex and uncertain, sometimes with a long tail and a nasty sting at the end. And the black elephants, challenges visible to everyone, but which no one wants to deal with. So we've got to go beyond simply admiring the scale of what we face, whether it's climate change, a pandemic, even more serious than COVID, or a devastating cyber attack, or whatever else it might be. And often the responses needed are threat neutral. The steps necessary are the same, whatever the hazard. The message is resilience needs to be designed in and part of society's fabric. But none of this is easy. It means planning for an uncertain future. It means preparing for the unthinkable. And it means being resilient against the unknowable. And what makes it all the more difficult is that our minds tend to be programmed in ways that make it hard to respond to novel risks and to protracted, complex challenges. We find it easier to believe that something might happen if it comes easily to mind. The more we can picture it, the higher our intuitive estimate of its likelihood. Then there is optimism bias, predisposing us to be over-optimistic about the risk of something bad happening and overconfident about our ability to cope if it does. And at worst, this can result in outright denial. And of course, it's harder to form sound judgments about how much effort to invest in preventing low likelihood, very high impact risks. And we're also subject to confirmation bias, that universal tendency to pay attention to what supports our existing beliefs while ignoring information that contradicts them. And groupthink, the inclination to follow the pack and to conform to the majority view. And finally, there is NIMPTO, not in my term of office. Being properly prepared and resilient is expensive. Adopting a preparedness philosophy means parking our just-in-time approach in favour of just in case, and being ready to build in redundancy into systems and avoid interdependency, which normally is the economic desire. Now, as a recovering politician, I know how difficult it is for our elected leaders to devote resources, by which I mean the public's tax contributions, to projects that do not come to fruition by the time of the next election, let alone the one after it, or build resilience that is probably invisible and may never be needed for an eventuality that may not happen. And it's usually impossible to prove that your actions have prevented something happening, particularly if that hypothetical event is at some indeterminate time in the future and almost certainly long after your term of office is forgotten. The same things exist in the corporate sector, particularly in a world with an increasing focus on annual returns and quarterly figures. So to be resilient and prepared, we need to scan the horizon. What is out there but not yet looming? Elijah's cloud no bigger than a man's hand. And where are Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns? The Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, is now inescapable. But there is another Chinese saying which suggests we gain wisdom from the experience of setbacks. So we have a setback and we must prepare for future setbacks. As I said earlier on, we must be prepared to expect the unexpected. And it is, of course, a truism that generals always prepare to fight the last war rather than the one that is actually coming. Sir David Oman, the former UK security coordinator, recasts it in a slightly different way. He said, what we prepare for, we deter. So what we actually experience by way of events is, alas, what we have not prepared for. The reality is that our nations, our cities and communities and our organisations have to have preparedness and resilience designed in. It has to be part of the society's fabric. Ultimately, it means that every single one of us have to see preparedness and resilience as their responsibility, just as much as it is the responsibility of public authorities, because there's always the assumption that someone else will sort it out. Be prepared was, of course, Lord Baden-Powell's motto for the Scout movement, so that automatically and instinctively you did the right thing at the right moment. Now, I'm not sure that the 1908 edition of Scouting for Boys or the 1912 version for girls entitled How Girls Can Help Build Up the Empire actually spelt out the implications of a global pandemic. But they did, at least in embryo, equip Baden-Powell's scouts with the principles of strategic risk management. Now, of course, being resilient and preparing for risks is not cost-free, but not doing so is worse. Or as John F. Kennedy put it, there are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range costs of comfortable inaction. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lord Toby Harris. There's some fantastic insights and thoughts to reflect on. And of course, if anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to make, please do put that in the Q&A and we'll pick that up following our speakers. So plenty to get us going there. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Amanda Janu, who is the Knowledge and Policy Lead Expert with the international Glasgow-based Wellbeing Economy Alliance. This is a collaboration of organisations, alliances, movements and individuals who are all working towards a well-being economy and delivering human and ecological well-being. Amanda is an economic policy expert and advisor to governments and international development organisations, and also has consulted extensively with the United Nations. She's worked throughout Africa, Asia and Europe, supporting a greater economic self-determination and empowerment, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts this evening. So thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. So I have a presentation that I'll share with you today. And it starts with this quote that I really like by Einstein, where he said, "Perfection of means and confusion of goals seems, in my opinion, to characterize our age." And I think that there is probably no area where this confusion between means and ends is clearer than when it comes to the economy, right? So when COVID hit and when massive crises like climate change present themselves, it can also often be really frustrating to see policymakers prioritizing the economy as if it matters more than our very survival. And so the question is, what is the economy, right? It's often presented as this huge, powerful force that's out there that we're here to serve. But the reality is that we are the economy, right? The economy is just a word that we use to describe the way that we produce and provide for one another. And the purpose of why we produce and provide for one another is to improve our quality of life. But somewhere along the way, we thought, okay, well, the whole purpose of the economy is to generate wealth, because wealth can be useful for improving our quality of life. And so we focused a lot on generating wealth and growing our economy. And as a result, we've gotten very good at it. Yeah. So GDP has been growing pretty much exponentially for a very long period of time. We've generated so much wealth now that I think it would be about, on average, about $70,000 for every person living in the world right now, right? So that's a lot of wealth. But the problem is, it's not really equating to improvements in our well-being and our quality of life anymore. And in fact, is leading many of us worse off. And so we see this obviously in extreme inequality that is between and amongst countries and individuals. We see this in the destruction of our planet and the ecological, sort of crisis that we're in. See this in rising amounts of depression and loneliness and despair, and then you add a COVID crisis on top of it, right? And you start to really realize, I think, as the UCL background paper really illustrated, that we have a very fragile system that's not working very well. And we've created a global civilization that is being, as I say, mediated by a certain form of economic globalization that is really imbalanced, right? So we allow for the movement of goods, but we put borders up for the people who made them. Yeah, we look at the world as one space for production and create global value chains, but we don't really think about the universal aspect of the resources that are a part of it. We allow for money to flow at, trillions of dollars per second, but we don't allow for the flow of ideas, right? We patent ideas. And so this imbalance is ultimately manifesting very clearly, and people are aware of it, right? So recent surveys have shown that the majority of people now believe that our current economic system is doing more harm than good. They don't believe we're going to be better off in 5 years, particularly in rich countries. And there's a growing distrust in government, a belief that government and policymakers are not in a position to deal with these crises because they're just working in service of the elite, right? And the people who have more money. And so all of this is leading to a lot of questioning about the standard way of doing things, both in policy and when it comes to the economy, because this standard approach has been number one goal of government is to grow the economy, because that's the way you generate wealth. And then you can take some of that wealth, right, through taxes to fix any of the damage that's done to people and planet in the process, right? But clearly this isn't really working. So the question of our age is, how do we move from just fixing and healing, tinkering and redistributing, crisis management, to really getting it right in the first place? How do we get to the root causes of these crises and the challenges of our time? And so this is very much what the vision of the well-being economy is. It's about building an economic system that does more of the heavy lifting and isn't just the problem, it is the solution. So how do we build a system that is fair and just, that actively ensures that we're producing things in a way that regenerates our natural environment, right? How do we ensure that we involve people so they feel they have a voice over their lives and the decisions that impact them? And how can we ensure that everybody has the foundations they need to live a life of dignity and freedom? So the well-being economy sounds great, yeah, but a lot of the question is, how do we get there? And it does require a different form of policymaking. And so your very own Nicola Sturgeon has a great TED Talk on this, on why government should prioritize well-being. So if you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking it out. But around the world, at very high levels, but also at local levels, we're seeing governments changing their notion of progress. They're really embracing new visions and measurements, moving beyond GDP, really focusing on social and ecological goals. They're going out and asking people what matters for your well-being, right? And starting to focus on that as the goal, as opposed to just wealth generation and economic growth. But then beyond that, right, we need to think about, how do we shift, if we move from thinking about the economy's purpose as generating wealth to generating well-being, it changes the kind of economic activities that are viewed as important, because for so long we've been providing tons of incentives and tax exemptions and all of these things for businesses that were really good and efficient at generating wealth, right? So large investors, large corporations, but it didn't take policymakers any time to identify who's really most essential for our maintaining current well-being. And they were not hedge fund managers, right? And they were not billionaires. They were teachers and farmers and workers, And so thinking through, how do we utilize policy to actively encourage those sectors and the kinds of activities and behaviors that are most important for well-being, is really about a mindset shift, right? And aligning stakeholders and to these processes. And so we're seeing that a lot of experimentation and moving beyond siloed approaches. So within government, trying to connect across agencies so that you're recognizing the intersections between your work, but also with across society at large, right? Seeing that business can be a driver of well-being, seeing the role of civil society in various groups and getting everybody on board together for this systems change. And really importantly, I think alongside this view that democracy is dying and that there's a distrust in government, we're seeing, especially this past year, the last 2 years, around the world, huge shifts in terms of local communities, municipal, regional, national, pushes for more participatory decision-making processes, yeah? Getting people involved through technological spaces or through citizens' assemblies, community discussion forums, so that they are actually in charge of saying what kind of economic policies they want, right? What kind of areas of the economy are important to them and to the future they want to see. And all of this, I think, really requires, I think as Lord Harris was saying, a really important emphasis on experimentation and learning, right? And that's really tough as policymakers to feel like you're allowed to fail, especially if you're thinking outside the box. And that's why I think we need to engage more broad-based participatory decision-making so everybody feels like they're a part of this process, right? They can understand the uncertainty and the tensions therein. And all of this also requires that the UK alone, right, is not going to be able to do this. It's going to require really visionary new forms of multilateralism and global governance to think about how we can make space meaningfully for greater self-determination and resilience. And so the Wellbeing Economy Governments, for example, is just a small example of countries that come together in the interest of redefining progress, right? Redefining development, redefining what it means to be successful in this world and supporting one another to look at how they can develop new governance and policymaking mechanisms to achieve that. And so I know I don't have a lot of time here, but those are some of my inputs on, I think, how we can move towards getting to the root causes and building a well-being economy for greater resilience and sustainability. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Amanda. Lots of really interesting and great things going on there, and always great to see a mind map in a presentation. I'm a huge fan of mind maps, and then that was really, really fascinating. Thank you very much. And of course, our unsung heroes are, of course, our NHS staff here who've been absolutely amazing. So good points there. So great. Thank you very much. So our final speaker today is Rowan Douglas, who's CBE and Head of Climate and Resilience at the Willis Towers Watson organisation, and he supports the management, regulation and financing of risks from climate, terrorism, cyber and other perils, which no doubt keeps him very busy. Previously, he served on the board of the group's reinsurance division, Willis Re, and as CEO of Global Analytics, and was appointed onto the UK's Prime Minister Council for Science and Technology in 2011 to 2016. He founded the Insurance Development Forum with the World Bank, United Nations and global industry leaders in 2015 to address the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreements. He was made CBE in 2016 for services to the economy through risk insurance and sustainable growth. So we're very excited to have you here today, Rowan. Please take it away, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karina. Can you hear me okay? Hello, Karina?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Hello, Karina?
Yeah, can you hear me fine?
Okay, Karina. Sorry, I'm just having a little... I can hear you now. I'm just having a wee bit of a comms problem, but hopefully it'll be all right. And just obviously, thanks so much for the invitation to come, and full marks to UCL for having the innovation to have a global governance institute as well as the Early Warning Research Centre, and to bring these two things together for this talk, because it absolutely sort of epitomises the kind of combined thinking that we need. And I'm perhaps going to pay Lord Harris and Amanda the greatest tribute by saying I've completely thrown away my pre-prepared notes, because you've set the scene so well, and sort of framed it so beautifully that I thought my earlier comments wouldn't be particularly helpful. But what I want to try and do is perhaps share some thoughts about how we can move forward, quite practically from the kind of sort of framing that you've so eloquently and sort of broadly provided. So I'm going to make a confession, and Karina, you kind of provided that for me anyway by confessing that I'm a reinsurance person. So I'm not a banker, but I am a reinsurance professional. And reinsurers deal with managing extremes, usually from Mother Nature, or maybe we should say Anthro Nature now, or extremes from US lawyers or people just smashing stuff up. And basically, reinsurers are there to protect governments or insurance companies against usually, as Lord Harris said, sort of very high impact, low frequency events, or just a strange combination of multiple events happening at the same time. And my other sort of confession is that I'm a geographer, not an economist. So I landed in the City of London in 1992. I'm sure many on the audience weren't even born in 1992, but I landed in Lloyd's of London the month that Hurricane Andrew smashed into the east coast of the US and did an awful lot of damage, and was the final punctuation mark on a series of unprecedented disasters which had happened around that time. Natural disasters, big problems with asbestos, oil rigs tragically blowing up in the North Sea. And that particular corner of the city, and actually the corner of the global financial system, was basically in meltdown. It was the equivalent of its sort of global financial crisis. Some people remember stories about names at Lloyd's, suffering very much, and it was a very significant problem. But the world needs insurance, and the world needs reinsurance, whether it's through public or private means. And sort of 30 years later, the industry, which has to cover a whole spectrum of challenges of sort of the non-economic nature, from pandemics to natural disasters to a whole manner of political risks, is actually now more resilient now, despite growing risk, than it was 30 years ago. And we sense that there might be a tiny flicker of insight in that strange journey from ruin to resilience that might have a broader value. And I want to just touch on that, and then perhaps pick up on the themes around governance that Lord Harris and Amanda mentioned. So sort of what came together in the mid-90s when the sector was on the floor, and that meant people couldn't be protected, was that people realized they shouldn't try and understand risk through what had happened, basically old claims files. They figured they should understand risk by what could happen. So they brought four elements together. They brought engineering metrics together in ways that we hadn't understood before: stresses, return periods, thresholds. Some of my geography came in handy, dynamic equilibrium. It brought together actuarial science, and it brought together geography, both human and physical, to try and understand in any place on Earth actually what could happen. But the final point that Amanda mentioned and touched on was actually the final element was imagination. That was the magic also ingredient, to try and imagine what could happen and bring various elements together. So essentially that required an understanding of, in the natural hazard space, storms or floods, or the nature of exposed assets, or crops or buildings, and their particular vulnerability to particular forces, physical or economic or whatever it might be. And the upshot was that a new discipline was born. It was called catastrophe risk modeling, not very well known outside of its strange sort of community of practitioners, but essentially capital in our sector began to use these sorts of models. And of course, all models are wrong, and these are wrong too, but at least the wrongness of them made you ask questions. And then regulators said, well, what should the stress level of an insurance contract be? And no one had ever asked that question. So they used engineering metrics, and suddenly insurance promises that you or I buy for our house here in Britain or around the world had to be resilient to the 1 in 200 maximum probable loss. We didn't even know what that meant. But the upshot was, and I'll fast forward 30 years, is that somewhat haphazardly, if you go to the annual report of a reinsurance company, so pick Swiss Re, quite a well-known one, you'll see there the financial risks they run from a whole range of catastrophes, exactly the sort of catastrophes that Lord Harris mentioned, right across the spectrum. And there's something very powerful there, because they've tried to understand how they are specifically vulnerable across their portfolios of homes and people and properties and crops. And the truth is, once you actually account for risk and have to disclose it, it makes something that is invisible visible. But it doesn't create risk, it simply makes it tractable. And once risk is accounted for, actually resilience becomes valued. And being a reinsurance company, having to be there as a backstop for society, regulators require Swiss Re or other companies to have enough capital to withstand those shocks. So it could be a big shock, but it might only happen once every 1,000 years. And our sense is that actually this type of accounting and this type of evaluation of risk, to go beyond the sort of the risk register list and actually put some money value to it within our core accounting processes in both the public and private sector, could have immense value. So now I'm going to perhaps finish with the broader observation around governance, and perhaps pick up some of Amanda's themes, because I work in this sector called insurance, which is tremendously unfashionable. But I have a funny feeling that maybe in 10 years' time it might become a little bit more fashionable, particularly in the context of climate, because I've tried to understand how insurance, in the work of someone like Ana Gonzalez, has been seen as an organizing institution of society, not just the insurance industry that you or I know by buying our car insurance or our house insurance, but much more fundamentally, how societies come together to understand and share risk through taxation or through premiums or through something in between. And when I look back in history, whether it was the history of how urbanizing communities in Scotland invented what became life insurance to allow the widows of Scottish clergymen and academics to have some sort of security, how it was that actually urban fires in the 1870s in America led to the requirement of insurance, which demanded to be resilient and sustainable building codes and zoning laws, or ultimately it was concerns over the health of the population in the turn of the last century in the UK that led the UK to try and emulate actually German welfare systems with some of our leading politicians at the time, Churchill and Lloyd George, in 1908, 9 and 11. And actually, when you look at the beginnings of the modern welfare state, it was some tragic research that showed that in the early 1940s, in the midst of the Second World War, the British population had become so traumatized by decades of war or economic depression or other vicissitudes that basically they had lost all hope for the future. And it was that complete lack of hope for the future, the kind of outline that Amanda painted so graphically a few minutes ago, that actually led in some ways to the political economy of the Beveridge Report and the war on wealth and idleness and the other four wants, or the four I forget the five illnesses of society at the time, which obviously led to the welfare state, including the NHS, and some sense that society must come together to protect across its between society, must protect what it values and give people a platform for hope and for growth. And the final sort of point I'll make is that when it comes to climate, and I think Lord Harris said something like we're all in it together, and with climate, ultimately we all own the risk. We may think we're okay if we live in a safe place in a nice part of the world, but within a few decades, whether it's us or our children or our children's children, we'll all pay the price. There will be a systemic crash which no one can escape from. So we all own this risk, and ultimately we all have to share it. And we have to, once we share it in some sort of system, just like managing urban fire 100 years ago, we will realize that we actually have to reduce and to manage it into a level of a tolerable approach. So I sense that, broadly speaking, we have to find mechanisms of properly understanding the scope of these global risks, accounting for them, recognizing that we all own them to some degree and we must all share them for collective benefit, but recognizing that actually currently the system will not be sustainable, and we will have to manage that shared system across the communities towards a much more risk managed and resilient future. And it's a bit like taking a medical. We're all going to have to pay the price.